the way I see it, the biggest challenge we're going to face is that human connection. So person to person connection, person to planet connection, really feeling like a connected community. As much as we are relying on digital connections, our connectivity with our neighbor has reduced. So I think we're going to have a crisis of being a connected community and having that community feel connected not just between humans, but between humans and planets, which means almost changing our thinking from being human-centered to living-centered, and from being individual-based to community-based. Well, I think more and more you're starting to see buildings being breathable buildings. I always say that during COVID, in many ways, our breath was held hostage. And we realized that we were struggling to breathe, but at multiple levels. So I think we're starting to see that we want buildings, communities, cities to be breathable. And how that manifests in the built environment is through more ventilation systems, more biodiversity, more green infrastructure, a lot more focus on in-between spaces. So we are starting to see a melding between the natural and the built that is mediated in some ways by the communities. I would go back to the idea of communities being seen as the lifeline of cities, building places that foster community, really thinking about not just climate resilience, but human resilience, and leveraging connectedness between people to do that. It can translate to some really, really simple things. So when we talk about green infrastructure, for example, to green at multiple levels, all the way from the interior to the urban infrastructure to the building infrastructure. It can be in small things like in-between spaces. In-between spaces became really powerful during the pandemic, and those buffer spaces, spaces that don't belong to anybody, but belong to everybody. Those are the kind of solutions we're starting to see get a lot of traction. We're actually working on something very similar right now. We are calling it designing for social resilience. And social resilience is where you have to balance safety with the ability to connect socially, right? So what does safe social connection look like? And again, the way to find built environment strategies to do that is finding that balance between the natural and the man-made. So some ways are being very, very focused on ventilation systems, not just mechanical ventilation systems, but natural ventilation systems. Being very, very mindful of airflow, being very mindful of agility and adaptability. So spaces can scale, they can expand and they can contract as you need them to. Using more buffer spaces and white spaces that can lend themselves to different uses. Having a less rigid programming approach, so more agility in the programming, and that can help. We've also found that community spaces tend to be large congregation spaces, but if you start breaking it down and have spaces at multiple scales, it can be very, very powerful. There's 6 strategies that we identified around resilience, community-built resilience, in a framework called Community Block. The first one was building not just net positive buildings from a carbon perspective, but net positive for a social health perspective. What does that mean where you can promote connectivity? The second principle is around cloud print and footprint. So being able to leverage the digital infrastructure where things that have to happen in person can move to the digital, and then when needed can move back. So during risk, you can maintain connectivity by leveraging digital, but at the same time, making sure you have a physical infrastructure to support it. The third principle that is really key is around intergenerational programming and multi-use, multi-sector programming. So we are very used to giving every space a single purpose, but when you allow a space to have multiple purposes and for it to be able to multiple stakeholders, it can become very, very resilient. So these are some of the 3 principles that we are working on. The other principle which allows for safe social connection is something like circuit breakers that Singapore, of course, has used very effectively. So if you can isolate an area very quickly and curtail it in that space, curtail any kind of contagion in that space, then other spaces can thrive around it. So that we have found to be very effective, and that needs careful, intentional planning early on to do that. So more or less, I think when you look at the community block principles, we build it on the idea that building a community is building resilience. And it is synonymous to building resilience. And if you can build these different interdependencies, not just connections, but interdependencies in a way that if one sector, one part, one person becomes vulnerable, another part of the system, another part of the community gives their strength, then that makes for a very, very strong system overall. And that is a resilient system that is based on using social connections as an energy source. And I think that's a piece that's missing in this narrative, is really building on our social capital as a source of strength. I think the biggest role perhaps for city government and private sector is to build powerful coalitions that engage the community as well. So we don't build partnerships enough where the government stakeholder, the private stakeholders, and the community stakeholders come together towards a co-benefit framework. And a co-benefit framework is where we can see the benefit to all stakeholders, to the individual, to the community, to the businesses and the economic infrastructure in a place, to the city and the region, and to the planet overall. So if we can find a place where there is a middle ground and we can understand the benefit to all stakeholders, then we are not always in the state of conflict. And I think finding these meaningful coalitions, convening these meaningful coalitions and partnerships can be very powerful. And to do that, it's really important that the government and the private sector comes together, engages the people who are the ultimate stakeholders, and really invests in authentic and transparent communication that goes across all the diversity in any community. And today, I think even more so, when you're looking at the community, to look at it not just from the point of view of those who can speak for themselves, but also from the point of view of those who cannot.